What's up, everybody? So I am back here at the desk instead of the front of the black screen, and today I want to talk about, well, it's half of a non-review and it's part of a sort of a general rant. So I'm working over the last, well, since early December 2019, I have been seriously looking to upgrade my video lighting setup. And since I've started doing videos, especially seriously in 2019, I have struggled tremendously trying to find a video lighting setup. Well, let me just say it. I have been struggling tremendously with video or with lighting with respect to video as a whole. So I've said in other videos, I've come to this whole video thing from a still photography background. I primarily shoot landscape and wildlife, so I'm not even like a commercial photographer, portrait photographer, or something like that who's shooting who would have a myriad of like soft boxes and studio strobes with high-powered modeling lights and so on and so forth. My primary light is the sun, and when I'm not using the sun, I'm using a basic hot shoe flash like a Canon 600EX RT. And that's all I've really needed. And even like the hot shoe flash, like when I'm doing, say, product photography for my website or whatnot, the hot shoe flash has been more than adequate for putting out the light and the image and the quality of light and so on and so forth. And I mean, I've augmented it with some modifiers over time, but nothing substantial and, big. And so going into the whole video world has been a marked product of trying to find lighting, because lighting in an interior for video, so first of all, obviously none of my strobes do me any good, because you can't use a strobe to light video. Doesn't do anything. Some of the light modifiers I can use, but it kind of comes down to trying to find better lights as a whole. Now, I've cobbled together the lights that I'm using to light this video, and I've been using to light the videos that I've shown over 2019 and early 2020. But they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, purpose-built video lighting. It's not a purpose-built video lighting solution. There's a limit to how much quality, color rendition, etc., that I can get out of these lights, and I'm, and their capabilities. It's a really sort of cobbled together setup using generic 90 plus CRI LED lamps that I bought on Amazon in a couple of 2x2 soft boxes that, again, were not all that expensive on Amazon. And I mean, I could make an argument where the setup is sort of more than adequate, but it's not very portable, it's not very controllable, it's kind of not, it has serious limitations. And where I'm trying to go with this is trying to find a video lighting setup, LED based, that's more portable, more controllable. It's something that I'm not just constrained to using in my office or at home or in a very limited number of locations because I don't have the infrastructure to power and control it. And I'd like to have something with a better color rendering index, better quality of light in that respect. And that's one thing that I found is very difficult. I mean, it's an inherent problem with LEDs, and we're now getting to where you can find consumer-grade LEDs marketed at 90 plus or better than 90 CRI, but are they really? And so that brings me sort of to the first thing that has really frustrated the heck out of me with respect to the video lighting industry or whatever, is LEDs have been a huge boon for the video lighting market, the continuous lighting market. They've enabled the market, or the market basically to explode with new companies bringing new ideas to market. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's a good thing. That's not necessarily, a bad thing. And it's increasing competition, which of course is good for us potentially because of lowering that tends to drive prices down. But it also means that it's bringing new ideas in terms of like how lights should be done, or features and capabilities that lights should have. And that's, like I said, I think that's a plus. The problem is there's not a tremendous amount of truth, I think maybe is the way to phrase it, in a lot of the advertising from a lot of the companies that are doing sort of the more budget features. I could be wrong. Maybe I am completely off in my test methodologies and setups, but I find that more often than not, in the panels that I've tested, at the distances that the panel claims to have a certain amount of light output, I'm measuring less, usually by a pretty substantial amount, maybe 20% in some cases. In cases where the panel, they claim the panel draws so much power, I'm measuring less, which would be, expected if it's not putting out as much light as they're advertising it as. But, that's sort of the how it's getting to the point where, like, I don't trust the data the manufacturers are putting out there. That they say that light has this capability, and I've now run into several lights that don't actually meet those standards that they claim that they're advertising the light. In some cases, it's not terribly off. They might advertise, say, 5600 Kelvin plus or minus 200, and maybe the light is 300 or something like that, which is still off, but it's not like 1000 Kelvin off or something like that. But then I run into lights where it's like they advertise things, and it's really hard for me to not consider the advertising, the marketing, not to be deceptive, or to not be deceptive. The lights just don't deliver what they're claiming. And this recently bit me. I just recently ordered, purchased, received, tested, and subsequently have returned a set of not very expensive. They were $200 panels. They were Draco Broadcast, Dracast S Plus series LED500 bicolor panels. And this is the non-review part. So I was getting ready, I usually review the stuff I bought or buy, good, bad, or ugly. And this was so bad that I got so agitated in the process of trying to quantify and understand how these lights performed that I basically decided I wasn't going to review them. I wasn't going to keep testing them. I wasn't going to fool around with them. I was just going to send them back. Now, in all fairness to Dracast or Draco Broadcast or whatever the company's actual name is, I could have got a defective panel. There are aspects that may have in fact been, that the light was not, was defective. And in all fairness to Draco Broadcast or Dracast, I don't have the fully most sophisticated test equipment. I've kind of wanted to buy the fully, like sophisticated color meters and stuff like that, but the reality is, like, a Sekonic color meter is a $1,600 tool, and if all I'm using it for is measuring 1 or 2 panels that I might test or buy total, maybe, certainly not a month, maybe a year if that, but I don't even think I'm going to be buying lights at that rate, then that kind of equipment, there's a lot better things that I could put $1,600 into. And there's a lot better things that I think a lot of photographers could put $1,600 into than test equipment that they're using to validate what manufacturers are claiming that something is. So what am I using for testing? Well, I'm using a i1 display colorimeter that has ambient light measurement capabilities in conjunction with DisplayCal or Argyle CMS, which allows me to make color temperature and brightness readings of the ambient light. So that's what, what the panel's putting out. I'm using my Sekonic light meter to ensure that the brightness readings that I'm getting from the Argyle or the i1 Display 2 are reasonable and within the same ballpark. I'm using a white acrylic, a pure white acrylic sheet as a test target that I could take a picture of that and then check the color balance with my camera to see what I'm getting for color balance, measurements from that in, say, Lightroom or Camera Raw. None of these are like purely scientific. None of these, in my experience, either provide or produce like truly ridiculous error. And in all of these cases, I'm tending towards having overlapping, multiple sources that I can, validate what I'm looking at. Now, again, not scientific testing, or it's not controlled laboratory testing. It's the kind of testing that a photographer has to do or would do. But I'm reasonably confident that if the colorimeter and the camera shooting a white target, a white calibration target, well, actually, and I'm also using a X-Rite color checker passport, which has calibrated targets on it too. So that's a third sort of white/gray source that's known to be and sold as being color neutral, and for color profiling, and so can be expected to perform properly. But none of these on their own am I like saying, okay, well, this sort of stands or this doesn't stand. Everything's kind of being cross-checked. So while I'm not confident that I can make a measurement to, say, 5 Kelvin or 50 Kelvin, I'm confident that when my camera and my colorimeter and my light meter all agree within some close tolerance, I'm getting a reasonable measurement. And then, of course, there's the old Mark I eyeball. And this is where I sort of ran into the problem with these panels, is I have, like I said, crappy, cheapo, these are $5 LED lamps in a cobbled together fixture that I'm using basically as my lighting setup. It's not tremendously bright, it's not terribly dark, but it's not tremendously or overly bright. And it doesn't perform, based on my testing, at quite the right color quite the advertised color temperature either, but in measuring it with a colorimeter and measuring it with the camera and the color check card and looking at, like, for example, the skin tone line in DaVinci Resolve, I'm fairly confident that these lights actually operate around 4,600 Kelvin. They're marketed as 5,000 Kelvin, but I'm fairly confident they operate around 4,600 Kelvin. So I get these lights, I set them up because my existing lights aren't, or I get a light because I was kind of concerned, you could say, about the quality of the lights that I was buying, and whether they were what I wanted, etc. So I ordered a light, I got it, I unpacked it, I started testing it, I decided that it seemed like it was a pretty good light, so I ordered a second one. Maybe a bit, well, actually a bit prematurely, very prematurely. It would have been better for me to have not ordered the second one, as I said, because I've subsequently had to return both of those lights due to the horribly abysmal performance that they put up. So I'm not running them necessarily at full power, because at full power they completely dominate the lights that I have, or the first one that I have, the only one that I bothered actually testing. Again, returns were already started because I was just so frustrated with what I got in the first light that I wasn't going to waste my time essentially screwing around with the second one to see if it was a specific issue to the light or a specific, something broader. And I'll get to some other points on these lights in a second. But I set the light to one of the advertising points that Dracast makes is they claim that there is no visible or perceptible color shift with changes in brightness. So they're bicolor LED panels, and it, in theory, is, well, I mean, in theory, it's possible, depending on how LEDs are dimmed and the quality of the LEDs, that any LED panel could have a color shift, whether it's bicolor or single color. But so I hooked up the panels and I started shooting, and I got up and I started doing a vlog. I don't remember now. Oh, I was ranting about the difficulty it is in finding good lights, and the fact that there's so many brands on the market that it's very difficult to just sort of identify which ones are good and so on and so forth and whatnot. And I was using the new LED500 panel as a key light, and I was using my 2x2 softbox with the existing lights as fill, because the LED could put out more light than my existing softbox setup could. And my on-camera, so I'm shooting on Canon 5D Mark IVs. They don't have an articulated screen, so I have to rely on a on-camera monitor to see what I'm looking at when I'm shooting. And my on-camera monitor, it's a small HD DP4. It's a 4-inch screen. It's not very big. I mean, it's big enough that I can see, yeah, I'm framed properly from across the room. It's big enough I can see, yeah, I'm framed properly. Okay, I'm framed properly. The picture looks reasonable. The exposure looks okay, etc., etc. But I can't really tell from across the room if everything's super good, or there's there's a sort of small color issue, or there's color issues. And it's not that the DP4 doesn't have the capability of presenting that, or showing that to me. It has more to do with the fact that I'm standing 6 or 7 feet away from the camera, and it's a 4-inch screen, and at that distance the picture's kind of tiny. And so, like, I don't have a tremendously great view of what I'm looking at. It's good enough, and it's probably better than a little on-screen 3-inch articulated screen, but a bigger screen would give me a better idea of what I'm looking at from across the room. And of course, I can't really have somebody stand in. I don't have somebody to stand in for me, so like I can't stand at the camera and look at things in detail. That said, even there, I'm looking at the picture on the LCD, and I'm going, that doesn't quite look right. But I pressed on, in part because it's new hardware, and there's always a teething period with new hardware where, at least I've found, there's a lot of perception in photography and videography, and it's very easy to you get something new and you don't trust it yet, and so your perception of what it's doing isn't always reflective of what it's doing. It may be working just fine, but because you haven't got the confidence in it, or at least this is the case for me, because I don't have the confidence in it yet, I see issues that maybe don't exist. And in a lot of cases, when I've run into this, I mean, in a lot of cases, I've been right. There's been an issue. But in some cases, it's just been something that I didn't have something set right because it's new hardware and I'm not familiar with it. So I pressed on, even though in the little screen with the little picture from across the room, things didn't quite look right. When I got everything into DaVinci Resolve, it was, and up on my 27-inch display, it was absolutely obvious that there was a massive Colorcast issue. The two lights were not putting out the same color light, not even close. You know, I'm not, first, I'm a guy, and that puts me at a slight disadvantage with respect to color sensitivity, and I've found that in a lot of cases, when it gets to really critical color stuff, I'm not the most observant and or sensitive person when it comes to detecting really fine differences in colors. Like, I have a friend who, like, he'll look at a picture in Lightroom and he'll go, nah, it's got a green cast, and he'll move the slider over 2 points to magenta and go, that looks fine, and to me it doesn't look like it changed at all. But I could clearly see a problem. I could clearly see a difference in the color across, like, the left side of me, the fill side to the key light side. And the light, so I went back and I'm looking at the light, and the light was set to 4600 Kelvin, which is what I've found these lights tend to be at. And I also have some very inexpensive, like $30 Viltrox battery-powered little LED panels that I picked up on Amazon that were, like I said, $30 or $40 a piece. I have 4 of them. They were sort of an early attempt at trying to find an LED solution that wasn't tremendously expensive, and they've turned into being, like, I wouldn't say they're something I'd want to use as a key light or primary lighting for video, but they're certainly bright enough that I can, you know, if I need to, I could use them, and they're battery powered, but they also make great work lights. They make great, if I need a ton of light on my desk, I can throw them up on a couple of light stands and really just flood my desk if I'm working on something that involves, you know, small parts or whatever. And these were not tremendously great lights, that these Viltrox lights. I was very not tremendously over impressed when I wrote my review of them, and you know, they had color issues and whatnot, but to my review. But what I found is, if I set them to say 4600 Kelvin, I came up with and measured the light, I came up with a number that was around 4600 Kelvin. It wasn't perfect. I wouldn't expect it to be necessarily, but it color matched with the lamps that I'm using just in general, just fine, and you know, at that setting. And so I started playing with the lights. I said, well, okay, well, maybe the new ones, the Dracast lights. I started playing with them, and I said, okay, maybe, you know, they just undershoot. Like, you know, I'm saying 4600 Kelvin, and maybe the lights are actually putting out, like, you know, 4400 or 4200 or something. It turned out, when I measured it, they were putting out about 42 to 4300 Kelvin, or 4100 Kelvin, something like that. Hang on, I have it written down. I can look. I think I have it written down. So they were putting out somewhere around, it looks like 4100 Kelvin. So they were 500 Kelvin warmer than they should have been per the setting. So I said, well, okay, like, you know, how do you address this? Well, the one way to address it is to crank the color temperature cooler. So I cranked the color temperature towards 5500 or 5600 Kelvin, towards daylight. And at this point, I've got my colorimeter out and I'm measuring it. And as I'm cranking the color temperature up, and it steps in 100 Kelvin increments, I'm not getting an increase in color temperature. It's still sitting at like 4300 Kelvin or something like that. Not like I would expect it to go up substantially. So, like, right off the bat, there's a, like, what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. Like, so on a lark, I decided, well, okay, let's crank the brightness up, because I'm running this light down at like 10% brightness and see what happens across the brightness range. And the light, as I crank the brightness towards 100%, the color's temperature starts cooling down. It starts, getting higher. My 4100 Kelvin starts going to 42, 43, 44, 45, etc., up to, I had it set at, say, 5400, I think it was, or 5500 Kelvin, and I'm at full brightness getting like 4800 Kelvin, which is still way off. Like, the light shouldn't be putting out 4800 Kelvin at 5600 Kelvin or 5500 Kelvin. The light should be putting out, like, I would say 4800 plus or minus 200, so between 46 and 52 or 5000. So there's this, it's obviously the marketing claim that there was no appreciable shift, and I could see the shift, especially noticeable when I had another light that was a fixed color temperature light that was, not shifting with it, but you could see the shift in color. So obviously the marketing claim that there's no appreciable shift in color temperature, well, that was kind of bogus. Now again, in all fairness, I only tested one lamp, and it's possible that the one lamp that I had an issue in the, that somehow, although I failed to see what exactly in an LED light, and I don't trout out this card very often, but I went to school for electrical or computer engineering, though I spent most of my time taking electrical engineering classes. I have a good idea how LED lights work. I have a good idea what potential failure modes would exist in the light and why they might behave some way, and I have a very hard time seeing how where a failure would be in the specific light that otherwise all the lamps lit, the control was, well, all the lamps lit, all the LEDs lit, they shifted from, and sort of obviously shifted in balance from daylight to tungsten and tungsten to daylight. And, otherwise everything that would obviously be normal, there was no apparent issue in terms of, like, some of the diodes weren't performing or weren't turning on or weren't whatever, everything appeared to be working fine. But, the light just did not behave as advertised. So there was definitely, that was definitely a problem. A serious perceptible shift in color over the dimming range. The thing that I think really broke my back, the hyperbolic straw that broke the camel's back. And this was something that started bothering me actually the minute I took them out of the package, but I didn't worry about it too much at first, but then it started to really grate on me as I used them a little. The lights are advertised by Dracast as having a 0 to 100% dimming range. Now, on a light like a light panel or pretty much any other light I've ever had any experience that advertises something like a 0 to 100% dimming range, if you turn the dial on the for brightness, And actually, well, let me step back a second. I'm back to color for a second. I mentioned that I had $30 El Cheapo panels from Amazon. And in the process of going through all this, I went back and looked at my review of those panels. They offered a 20 to 100% dimming range, which I was sort of critical of, but in retrospect, maybe not, shouldn't have been quite as critical considering the performance of these in terms of dimming range. And I went back and one of the things that I charted when I was testing those panels was the variance in color relative to intensity. So if I set the light to a certain power and then adjusted the intensity in like 10% increments, or I don't remember exactly what I used, how much did the color vary at those settings? Now, those lights weren't even marketed, if I remember correctly, with a claim of, no perceptible color shift. They were marketed as like, these are the cheap ass video lights, what do you expect for $30 kind of thing. And when I tested them, there was a variance of less than 50 Kelvin across the brightness range in terms of color temperature. And these $200 Dracast lights couldn't hold 200 Kelvin across the brightness range, and in many cases was more like 600 or 700 Kelvin across from 10% to 100%. So not exactly tremendously great performing lights in that respect when it comes to color. So as I said, the straw that proverbially broke the camel's back, or in some ways was the first grain of irritation, is the lights were advertised as 0 to 100% dimming. And with any other panel that I've ever seen or dealt with or looked at or watched somebody mess with on YouTube or something like that, or tried in a store, that meant that if you turned the brightness knob on the back of the panel, you could go from off while the physical power switch was still on, you could turn it all the way to off, and the panel would not show up, would not produce any light, all the way to full brightness. Well, you could turn these panels off. There was a power switch, and you could turn the panel off by flipping the power switch. The physical brightness dial, or the brightness dial on the panel, only went from 10 to 100% in 5% increments. Now, I might be willing to forgive the 5% increments, but to claim that the panel supported 0 to 100% dimming, I think is, again, something where I would argue that that's at least borderline misleading, if not outright misleading in terms of advertising. But in terms of what I would expect as compared to sort of the rest of the industry, I kind of would expect that the dimming knob would cover that full range. The other problem I had was the 5% increments. So again, referencing my El Cheapo $30 panels or sub $30 panels, they adjust in 1% increments. Now, when it comes to lights, video lights especially, I don't particularly care for the way the power levels are done. I'm used to photography in flashes where you have adjustments and stops, and you have a consistent increment of, say, a third stop or a 10th stop across the whole range of stops that the light can be adjusted on. So, for example, my 600EX flashes have a 7-stop range. They go from full power to 128th power, which is 7 stops. And each stop you can adjust step through in a third stop increment. So the first stop, full power, minus a third, minus 2/3, minus a stop and a third, etc., all the way down. The problem with percents is they sound good in sort of marketing sense. Oh, 50 to 20 to 100% brightness control or something like that. But in terms of stops, it's not actually a tremendous amount of range. Moreover, it's a linear setting, so your first stop covers of brightness adjustment covers from 50% or 51% to 100%. And so you have 50 increments essentially through that brightest stop. Then you get to the second brightest stop, and that covers from 26% to 50%. So now you're down to 25 increments. And then your next stop down goes from 12.5% to 25%. And so if you're generous, you have 13 increments, but you might have 12 increments depending on how it goes, because almost nobody would give you 0.5% or finer increments. And so all of a sudden, for example, with these LEDs, these Dracast LEDs, the 10 to 100% range that sounds great on paper or in marketing turns out to be a 3 1/3 stops of brightness control. Now, given the fact that only about the brightest stop didn't exhibit a significant color shift, at least for intermediate, for not the tungsten or daylight colors, you really only had about a 1-stop usable range of brightness for these lights. Everything else you had to, it was just, you had big chunk stops. So, and in fact, even on top of that, there was, because you didn't have 1% increments, you could go from 100 to 50, so you could do that first stop, fine. You could do the second stop, fine, because 25% ends on essentially a multiple of 5. The third stop, you couldn't actually stop at the third stop. You had to go all the way down 3 1/3 stops essentially to 10%. You couldn't, stop at that stop if you needed it. You lost that level, that fine-grained control. And that's not something that you can necessarily say isn't important, because where you are operating in terms of absolute light output, you still need to have control over, and fairly find a level over how much light you're putting out, because, for example, you need to balance with other lights, or you have specific camera settings that you're targeting. I mean, shooting video, our frame rates or our shutter speeds are fairly limited. Our frame rates are fairly limited, therefore we don't have a tremendous amount of range of over and under fine adjustments, etc. And while the third stops may not necessarily line up directly with camera third stops, because it's light, it's not, guaranteed to match with your exposure with your camera exactly. You can't, for instance, like I said, I was having to run the panel to balance with the ambient lighting that I was working with and the existing lights that I had in the temporary sort of, until I figured out, getting more lights, etc. I was running at 10%. If I needed the light to be a little, a third stop brighter, I couldn't go to 13% or 12%, depending on how you want to look at it. Even though that was a relevant shift in brightness that I had to deal with, or that I needed in the video that I was shooting. And I couldn't just simply make that adjustment on the light. So, as I said, this isn't a review. Reviews for me, I would have the product, I would be showing you stuff. This is I am so frustrated with LED lighting that I have gone, first of all, this is sort of a warning to anybody who's looking at these panels. I don't think they're worth the money. Obviously, you know, there's certainly a me factor here. I've had a very hard time giving up quality of light in terms of color rendition when it comes to LEDs. You know, I want the best that I can get in terms of LED and color rendition, and not being 100% willing to drop thousands of dollars on panels means, well, I can't really get that. I have to make a compromise there. I'm also not willing or unwilling to say that I am maybe more demanding of LED panels than a lot of other photographers might be, or videographers might be. I've been working on an Arduino-based LED controller. I've spent a lot of time sort of doing R&D on that because, in part, I wanted to do it, and in part because I was trying to figure out a panel solution that would give me the amount of control and the extent of control that I wanted in an LED light that I wasn't really finding. Like, for me, having, say, 10th stop increments is important. I don't need one, you know, a 50th of a stop increment over the brightest stop as an adjustment, but I could certainly use more than, you know, half stop or a whole stop increments in the darkest adjustments. Likewise, I'm not comfortable with a lot of the lights that only have 2 to 3, you know, 3 or so stops of dynamic range coming from photography flashes where I could see, you know, 6, 7, 8, even 10 stops of dynamic range in the flash. And so that's something I've been working on. And so I know what I can do, and I'm not a major manufacturer. I'm a guy working in his office with Arduinos and LED commodity LEDs that I can get my hands on, and I know the capabilities that I can put into something that I'm designing. Now, you could argue, well, yeah, but it's not mass manufactured, but a lot of this is just software and electronics, and when it comes to something like 5% dimming ranges, you know, or dimming steps, or using stops instead of percents, that's just software on these things. And that's something that doesn't take, you know, a huge amount of R&D work to set up and do. And it's something that I haven't seen anybody in the LED world doing, is, you know, dimming in stops instead of percents. But anyway, there's certainly a level, and I'm willing to acknowledge that I'm being very demanding in terms of what I expect a light to do. Of course, on the same token, it's clear that there are products out there that aren't very expensive. They're not very bright, but they're not very expensive, that can do these things better than what I was getting out of a $200 light. The $30 lights that I got on Amazon, the Viltrox ones, were more than capable of holding plus or minus 50 Kelvin, give or take. It's a little more complicated than that, but they were very capable of holding their color temperature over essentially the entire dimming range, not just the brightest stop, the brightest 50%. So, you know, one of the frustrations that I've really had with the whole LED lighting photography, videography market is there are so many companies now, and this is kind of how I ended up with these lights, is it was a stab in the dark. I had looked at a lot of different companies, a lot of different manufacturers, a lot of different options, and at, you know, various price points, and I ended up just saying, well, I'm going to give these a shot. And that shot failed, obviously. And the sort of experience that I had with these lights, I will probably never look at another Dracast lighting product again, because if you can't get the software and stuff right and the advertising right for your $200 lights, why would I want to even start to trust $1,000 light from you? Like, that just seems to me like I'm gonna, the care wasn't there in the advertising for the cheap light. Then when you get to the expensive light, it's just gonna be more heartache, I think. You know, now obviously anybody out there who wants to, you know, buy a light, you're more than welcome to you know, go with whatever you want. But like I said, I would not consider these lights again. I would not consider probably anything from this company again, at least lighting wise. They make other stuff, and other stuff may be okay, but the lighting stuff left a really bad taste in my mouth, given the performance and the way it worked, and sort of the marketing and the features and whatnot that were presented. So I'm back to my old lighting setup, which I really wished I was going to be able to update or upgrade, because 2-foot softboxes are kind of frustratingly large in a small shooting environment or shooting space. But the quality of light in terms of softness is something I'm very comfortable with, and I'm okay with. I think it looks okay, or good, if not, you know, okay, if not good. The color is something that I have been able to match across the board with my lights, so I'm not, you know, struggling to, you know, make things color balance and whatnot. I've generally been able to get the color, you know, sort of on everything to sync, and frustratingly, I think I've kind of given up on the search for like lights for the time being, because this has been a really frustrating experience. I mean, it was a really frustrating experience going through trying to do all the research I could through the month of December and early January, looking at all these options from all these companies who generally don't provide consistent photometric information, or incomplete photometric information, or you know, whatnot, and sort of trying to figure out where everything's going. So I'm going to wrap this up here. I'm doing this video instead of the video that I'm supposed to be working on, which is actually a series on lights and lighting. But I really wanted to talk about this while it's all still fresh in my mind, and I still have notes and haven't decided to sit down and erase most of those or whatever, because they weren't relevant anymore. But I know this has run quite a bit longer than I would normally do these vlogs. I'm trying to keep them shorter than an hour. But if you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please smash the like button. If you didn't, well, you know what to do. For more content on photography, videography, documenting my experiences, trying to learn and understand videography at a high level, as well as, you know, I'm hoping to get into doing some travel stuff and so on and so forth, because that's what I actually would rather be doing than trying to learn how to shoot video. You know, please subscribe to the channel. I'm working on, I actually literally have the script and it's supposed to be recording it instead of this video, but I'm working on a series that's sort of going through lighting for video from A to Z, from kind of the physics of how the various lighting technologies work, to my ultimate goal is all the way up to how to light in various situations, and sort of all the things that I've had to figure out that I've never seen really covered in other YouTube videos or in guides or books or other things. So that's, you know, if that sounds interesting, again, please subscribe. Also, I have a lot of older, well, it's not that older, but I have a lot of written content on photography and travel. So if you're interested in traveling and taking pictures, especially on the wildlife and landscape side, I have some content on that. on my website at pointsandfocus.com. So if that kind of thing, or I've also got camera gear reviews and stuff like that there. So if that kind of thing sounds interesting to you, please check it out. Again, thanks for sticking through this long video. I guess, until next time.